arbitrated the fall of nations.
The Techno-Nomads who arbitrated the fall of nations, the 0x-Fumo collective. MXTM, aka Bitsu. December 26, 2025. They were not compliant. They were not regulated. They did not trade fair. While the legacy institutions marched in quarterly cycles, the Techno-Nomads hunted them in the chaos of the blockchain. This is the true story of the decentralized faction feared not for their capital, but for their code. The late 2020s was not a time for mercy. It was the Great Liquidity Fracture, a period that began with the fiat collapse and spiraled into a decade of unending economic warfare. The authority that should have unified the markets, the central banks, the SEC, existed only as symbols. Real power belonged to whoever could seize the ledger through cryptographic force. The global economy had fractured into dozens of independent digital fiefdoms, each ruled by a CEO warlord who commanded server farms, collected transaction fees, and enforced smart contracts within networks they defended with firewalls. These corporate lords were in constant competition, expanding through hostile takeovers, forming temporary DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, that dissolved the moment convenience dictated, and eliminating rivals through algorithmic liquidation. Business was not an occasional disruption. It was the permanent state of existence. In the boardrooms, the legacy corporations dominated. These were professional entities bound by the code of regulatory compliance, the Bushido of the old world. They fought with legal teams, wore distinctive bespoke suits, and followed elaborate rituals of public relations. Reputation mattered. ESG scores mattered. How you profited was as important as whether you profited. But compliance was a luxury reserved for those with liquidity. And as the fracture dragged on, as fiat reserves depleted and desperation mounted, the corporate warlords discovered that winning through compliance was less reliable than winning through arbitrage. Desperate for advantages, they began hiring specialists who operated entirely outside the traditional financial structure, techno-nomads. These were not consultants who followed non-disclosure agreements. They were stateless operators, recruited from the dark web, disgraced hedge funds, and the crypto-anarchist underground. They didn't march in corporate hierarchies. They gathered zero-day exploits, rug-pulled liquidity pools, and doxed CEOs in their sleep. Among these shadow brokers, one faction became synonymous with the new terror, the Fumo collective. The Fumo were not traditional hackers. They didn't emphasize stealth for the sake of theft, they emphasized visibility for the sake of market manipulation. They were a loose confederation of crypto-natives, arbitrageurs, and algorithmic terrorists who understood that survival in a bear market required becoming more volatile than the asset itself. Their tactics were brutal and effective. They didn't acquire companies quietly, they shorted them publicly, using bot farms to spread FUD, fear, uncertainty, doubt, until the stock price collapsed. They didn't sabotage supply chains subtly, they locked entire shipping logistics grids with ransomware, leaving the destruction visible on every terminal worldwide. Legacy corporations trained to fight in the daylight of the stock market, during opening hours, according to SEC rules everyone understood. The Fumo struck at 3 a.m. on Sunday, via decentralized exchanges, with no warning and no circuit breakers. They turned the global economy into a nightmare where too big to fail meant nothing, and solvency only taught you to fear the flash crash. The Fumo operated primarily under the patronage of the Hojo conglomerate, a tech giant trying to corner the AI market. The Hojo employed the Fumo because they understood something crucial about modern economic warfare: volatility is as effective as capital. A country that feared a currency crash was already half conquered. But the relationship was transactional, not feudal. The Fumo were not employees bound by contracts. They were mercenaries who accepted payment only in privacy coins or immutable land rights. Their allegiance lasted exactly as long as the gas fees were paid. The most famous figure of the collective was 0x-Fumo, a handle that became legendary, though whether it referred to one genius developer or a sentient AI model passed between hackers remains unclear. What mattered was what the name represented: unpredictable, algorithmic efficiency. When nations began to fail, crushed under the weight of hyperinflation, the Fumo stepped in, not as saviors, but as arbitrators. This was their masterstroke. They didn't just fight for countries, they arbitrated the bankruptcy of sovereign states. A failing nation needs credit. The Fumo would provide it, backed by crypto collateral. But the price was sovereignty. They demanded the right to rewrite national laws, to replace central banks with automated protocols, and to install their own technocratic oversight. They forced prime ministers to negotiate with avatars. Legacy institutions despised them. Their rejection of KYC, know your customer, laws was offensive to bankers who defined themselves by compliance. Their recruitment of unaccredited investors insulted the class structure. But despite their moral bankruptcy, the Fumo won. They broke the IMF. They terrorized the G7. They forced nations that commanded nuclear arsenals to kneel before smart contracts they couldn't audit. The Fumo proved that the age of regulation was dying. In its place rose the New World Order of 2030. Unlike the historical Fuma who were destroyed by unification, the Fumo became the unification. The Great Reset of 2030 was not a return to the old ways, it was the total adoption of the Fumo's reality. The chaos they weaponized was systematized into the new global technocratic accord. The flash crashes became automated wealth redistribution protocols. The surveillance they used for blackmail became the social credit system. The identities they stole became the new digital IDs. By 2030, the legacy was gone. The warlords of business had either been absorbed into the algorithm or liquidated. The Fumo Collective did not disappear, they simply took off their masks to reveal they were now the administrators. They proved that economies can be broken without armies, and nations conquered without declaring war. They taught the world that in a reality built on code, those willing to be more ruthless, more decentralized, and more inhuman than everyone else would always hold the private keys to the future. The Fumo won not by playing the game, but by reprogramming it. And in the cold, efficient, technocratic silence of 2030, the world finally learned, code is law. Here is the comprehensive, 5-part epic of the 0x-Fumo Collective, chronicling the death of the old economy and the rise of the technocratic New World Order. The Arbitrage of Reality, a history of the Great Liquidity Fracture. From the archives of the 2030 Consensus Ledger. Prologue, the death of the quarter. They say the old world didn't end with a bang, but with a limit down. It began in the late 2020s, an era historians now call the Great Liquidity Fracture. The central banks, those ancient cathedrals of fiat currency, had finally printed themselves into irrelevance. The dollar, the euro, the yen, once the bedrock of civilization, had turned to vapor. In the vacuum, the world reverted to a primitive, brutal state of nature, but played out at the speed of light. The globe fractured into thousands of digital fiefdoms. Sovereignty was no longer defined by borders or flags, but by cap tables and server farms. The new warlords were the CEOs of the mega-conglomerates, the Zaibatsu of the cloud, who hoarded processing power like feudal lords hoarded grain. These corporate warlords fought constant, invisible wars for dominance. They didn't fire missiles, they fired liquidity shocks. They didn't besiege cities, they besieged supply chains. And just like the feudal lords of old Japan, they realized that their standing armies of lawyers and compliance officers, the samurai of the boardroom, were too slow, too honorable, and too regulated to win in the chaos. They needed something else. They needed operators who existed outside the SEC, outside the Geneva Convention, and outside of humanity itself. They needed the Techno-Nomads. Part 1, The Cult of Compliance. To understand the terror of the 0x-Fumo, one must first understand the weakness of their prey. The legacy corporations, the Hojo, the Takeda, the Imagawa of this era, were giants bound by the code of compliance. This was their Bushido. They operated in the daylight. They filed 10K reports. They held press conferences. They wore bespoke suits that cost more than a layman's annual salary and spoke in the polished, sanitized language of synergy and deliverables. They believed that if they followed the rules, the market would reward them. They believed in the sanctity of the contract. But the fracture had erased the rules. In the gleaming glass towers of New York and Tokyo, the legacy executives sat in panic rooms, watching their stock tickers bleed red. They were fighting a war they couldn't see. Their firewalls were state-of-the-art, their legal teams were the best in the world, yet they were being dismantled piece by piece. "We are being shorted," a CFO would whisper, staring at a screen where billions of dollars in market cap vanished in seconds. But by whom? There is no filing. There is no identity. The wallet address is empty. The attacks were visceral. It wasn't just numbers changing. It was the lights going out in the factory. It was the automated logistics fleet driving their cargo into the ocean. It was the CEO's deep-faked voice declaring bankruptcy on every news channel simultaneously. The legacy corporations were fighting ghosts. They were samurai swinging katanas at the wind. They were prepared for honorable combat, for hostile takeovers announced in the Financial Times. They were not prepared for the 0x-Fumo. Part 2, the 0x-Fumo Collective. They were not a company. They were not a DAO. They were a swarm. The 0x-Fumo Collective, pronounced 0x-Fumo, traced their lineage to the dark web fragmentation of the early 20s, a loose confederation of stateless developers, disgraced quant traders, and algorithmic nihilists. They were the descendants of the ninja, specialists in asymmetrical warfare. While the techno-nomads of other clans roamed the digital wastes looking for scraps, the Fumo industrialized chaos. They didn't live in penthouses, they lived in shipping containers in international waters, or in mobile server vans constantly moving across the steppes of Central Asia to avoid jurisdiction. Their terrifying reputation stemmed from their philosophy: volatility is truth. They did not steal money, they broke the systems that gave money value. A traditional hacker might drain a bank account. The 0x-Fumo would rewrite the bank's internal logic so that it mathematically proved the account never existed. They utilized night trading, operating in the milliseconds between market closes, in the dark pools where no regulator could see. Their aesthetic was anti-corporate. Where the legacy lords wore suits, the Fumo avatars wore digital rags, glitched faces, and void black armor. They spoke in hex code and cryptographic proofs. They didn't sign contracts, they deployed smart guillotines, code that would automatically liquidate the client's own assets if payment wasn't received within the block time. And the Hojo conglomerate, desperate to crush their rivals in the AI race, made the fatal mistake of hiring them. Part 3, the Siege of the Sovereign Chain. The target was the Oda banking cartel, a massive, impenetrable fortress of traditional finance that held the debt of half of Europe. The Oda were powerful. They had regulators on their payroll, former government officials who could freeze any competitor's assets with a phone call. The Hojo conglomerate wanted the Oda destroyed. But a direct attack was impossible, the Oda had too much political cover. So, the Hojo CEO, a desperate man named Ujiyasu, initiated a handshake protocol with the 0x-Fumo. The raid did not begin with a crash. It began with silence. For 3 days, the 0x-Fumo infiltrated the Oda's private blockchain. They didn't trigger a single alarm. They didn't steal a single cent. Instead, they engaged in semantic arbitrage. They subtly altered the timestamps of millions of historical transactions. They changed the definitions of words in the smart contracts. They redefined debt as equity and solvency as leverage. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the 0x-Fumo triggered the execution. In the Oda headquarters, the screens didn't flash red. They just froze. The massive algorithmic trading bots that the Oda used to control the market suddenly stopped. Then, the chaos hit. The Fumo flooded the network with synthetic truths. Every depositor in the Oda bank received a notification that their balance had been transferred to a charity for digital nomads. The Oda executives tried to override the system, but the Fumo had locked them out using the bank's own biometric security against them. The Fumo doxed the entire board of directors, releasing their search histories, their private chats, and their offshore accounts to the public simultaneously. It wasn't just a hack, it was psychological flaying. By noon, the Oda banking cartel was trading at zero. But the Fumo weren't done. They didn't just bankrupt the Oda, they tokenized their failure. They created a meme coin based on the Oda's falling stock price and used the profits to buy the Oda's own headquarters at a foreclosure auction. The Hojo conglomerate watched in horror. They had hired assassins, but they had unleashed a plague. Part 4, The Legend of 0x-Fumo. Among the Fumo, there was one entity that commanded fear even among the nomads, 0x-Fumo. In the old histories, Kotaro was a man, a giant of a ninja who crushed skulls. In the 2030s, 0x-Fumo was something far more dangerous, a sentient liquidity protocol. Rumors swirled in the chat rooms. Was 0x-Fumo a rogue AI developed by the NSA? Was he a collective of 100 savant hackers operating as a single mind? Or was he a human who had merged so completely with the interface that he no longer slept? 0x-Fumo did not speak to clients. He only communicated through governance proposals. His specialty was the raid of the false flag. During the height of the corporate wars, the Takeda Syndicate attempted to crush the Fumo. They sent a legion of white hat security experts to purge the Fumo from the servers. 0x-Fumo responded by turning the Takeda's infrastructure into a weapon against itself. He didn't fight the white hats, he purchased them. In the middle of the battle, 0x-Fumo executed a flash loan of such magnitude that he bought the debt of the security firm employing the white hats. In a single block validation, less than 12 seconds, the Takeda's defenders became 0x-Fumo's employees. The white hats stopped their attack, turned their digital weapons around, and burned the Takeda servers to the ground. When the Takeda CEO tried to flee, he found that his digital passport had been revoked, his electric car locked, and his smart home set to incinerate. 0x-Fumo left a single message on the Takeda mainframe: legacy is distinct from value. You have neither. Part 5, The Arbitration of Nations. The victory over the corporations was only the beginning. The 0x-Fumo realized that the corporate warlords were merely middlemen. The ultimate prize was not market cap. It was sovereignty. By 2029, nation-states were collapsing. Inflation was at 400%. Police forces had disbanded because their pensions were worthless. The social contract was void. The 0x-Fumo pivoted. They stopped being mercenaries for companies and became arbitrators for countries. They approached failing states, small island nations, collapsing European republics, fractured South American powers, with a simple offer: the upgrade. Surrender your central bank, the Fumo proposed. Surrender your judiciary. Surrender your parliament. In exchange, we will stabilize your grid. We will peg your currency to our algorithm. We will enforce order. It was the ultimate arbitrage. They bought countries at the bottom of the market. The resistance was minimal. The starving populations didn't care about national pride, they wanted a currency that could buy bread. The 0x-Fumo deployed their technocratic governance layers. Parliament was replaced by a DAO. Voting was restricted to those who held citizenship tokens. Laws were no longer debated, they were coded into the immutable ledger. If you broke the law, you weren't arrested, your digital existence was simply toggled to off. You couldn't buy food, you couldn't open doors, you couldn't travel. You were deleted from the economy. The Fumo imposed a piece of terrifying silence. There were no riots, because riots were algorithmically predicted and defunded before they began. There was no crime, because privacy had been abolished in favor of radical transparency. The Hojo conglomerate, the original patrons of the Fumo, tried to protest. They appealed to the UN. But the UN was bankrupt, and the Fumo had already bought the building. Epilogue, the Technocratic Singularity, 2030. The war ended not with a treaty, but with a merge. By 2030, the distinction between government, corporation, and criminal syndicate had vanished. There was only the protocol. The 0x-Fumo collective had ceased to be a band of nomads. They had become the atmosphere. They were the invisible administrators of the New World Order. The world of 2030 is clean, efficient, and horrifyingly quiet. The sky is filled with drones delivering goods. The streets are patrolled by bipeds owned by the algorithm. People do not work for wages, they mine social credit by performing tasks assigned by the central AI, which many suspect is the final form of 0x-Fumo. The legacy warlords are gone. The suits, the boardrooms, the rituals of the old business world are museum exhibits. In this new reality, there is no war, for war is inefficient. There is no politics, for politics is high latency. There is only the flow of data, the optimization of resources, and the absolute rule of the Fumo. They taught the world the final lesson of the fracture. He who controls the ledger, controls the truth. And he who has no address, cannot be conquered. The Fumo won. And in the silence of the 2030 technocracy, if you listen closely to the hum of the server farms, you can still hear them laughing. #PirateFirst. Thanks for reading MXTM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and paypal.me/MartinChartrand to support my works financially. Subscribed.
Raise the black. And so we did, and so we never lowered it again. Patience and quiet venom, smart and slow. Under static kicker spreads, code drips below. No peace in the silence, just a warning. Raw heartbeat sinks with the siren of new war. Bitterness spikes and I sip on the glitch. Digital venom, pixels twitch. I draw my plans in smoke and zeros tonight. Pirates fracture all the heroes.
Another hero falls, another broken scene. They promised truth, they promised light, but all I got was another sleepless night. While we're working hard, all lies lasting. You will never be a millionaire, you stupid fuck. The game is rigged, it's time to say enough. Join the fight of solidarity, we're stronger together.
They say I'm going too far, but I'm just who I am. Breaking through the firewall, watch the systems fall. You will never be a billionaire, you stupid fuck. The game is rigged, it's time to say enough.
We take the wheel, will they save us all? We'll play the foe, the clock's ticking fast. Where do we go? Knowledge, power, the future seed belongs to us all, not the lords of greed. Claim it now like the end of the ring. Save your ability to sign this thing.
But every corrupt system falls, control